Morning everyone, Joy of Quilting here. I finished my log cabin blocks, which I did in earlier videos, and I've put it together in the layout that I want to stitch it together. Today we're going to stitch the rows together. If you cut accurately and sewn accurate 1/4 inch seams, your blocks should be all the same size, but you can check what size they would be using a square ruler. Mine should be 5.5, and there we are, they're 5.5. If they were a bit over, you could trim them down. So I've laid these out, and now I need to mark them so I know where I am. There's several ways to do this. You can get little pieces of paper and write the row numbers on. There are 4 blocks in each of my rows. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I usually mark them by pinning a piece of paper saying row 1, that's to the left, a little arrow pointing which goes next. If you want, you could mark up each block. As this is only 4, it shouldn't be too confusing, and I am going to leave them laying here and pick them up in pairs and stitch them in pairs. So here are my first 2 blocks. I'm going to stitch that onto that. Because there's so many seams that I want to match, I am going to use some pins. And I'm going to pin, I can show you. Check the seams, that the seams are matching. And you put a pin in lengthways, not across, lengthways. If you put the pin across, things can still move. When they're lengthways, they can't shift. I put another one, look a little bit further along, put another one, trying to match up the seams. So when I stitch them, the seams will match. Okay, I've pinned 2 ready for stitching. So still using a 1/4 inch seam, and stitch slowly. And if you've got the needle down, so you can always stop with the needle in your work, use that. It helps to hold your work in place. And you can draw the pins out as you come to them. And then go past, stitch, there we go. Okay. And then you can carry on and stitch the second one. This is the second pair from the top row. Okay. Stitch those 2. You can then cut those 2 apart, open them up, and stitch the one to the other. So you've got a line of 4. And here's the first row stitched together. I put that, laid that back in place, and I'm now going to stitch those 2 together, those 2 together, and then stitch those together to create my second row. And here's the second row stitched together. So I'm ready now to put row 1 onto row 2. First of all, we need to press them. Okay, pressing the rows. Exactly the same as we've done before. I always press the stitches in place before I press them either one way or the other. Here we go. This is row 2. I've already pressed row 1. So there's row 1, which is going to go right together onto row 2. I've pressed all of row 1 seams that way, so row 2 will have to go in the opposite direction. So I'm going to go that way, that way, that way. Give it a nice press from the top as well. Okay. Here are my row 1 and 2 ready to stitch together, all pressed. So I'm going to put row 1 on top of row 2, right sides together, and I'm going to pin vertically. And I usually start at one edge, look where the seams are, okay, check the seams and make sure they're meeting, hold them, put a pin in that way, which holds them, put it either side, and I usually do the opposite edge, okay, make sure they're meeting, pin and pin, and then you're going to continue pinning. You may have to ease it in place. I usually would go with the middle, pin either side of the middle, and then in the middle of those two again, and just work my way pinning. You can ease some of it into place, okay, and that way your seams should meet. You then need to stitch it, and here I am ready to stitch it. You see it's really well pinned because there are so many seams. So stitching again a 1/4 inch seam. So we now have rows 1 and 2 joined together. I then press where I've just sewn, okay, and then this time I'm going to press my seams open. Don't do this very often, but there are an awful lot of layers here, and where these joins are, if I went one way, we'd have up to 8 layers of fabric all together, and that's a bit thick. So I'm actually going to do these open. Okay, once you've gone across and pressed your seam open, turn it over. There's another little press, and there's row 1 and 2 put together. And here's row 1 and 2 all stitched. Next thing, I sew together the first 2 in row 3 and the next 2, sew them together, the same with that row, sew that row to that row, and I would then sew those 2 rows onto those 2 rows by putting that on top of there and stitching. Work my way down the quilt until the whole quilt was stitched together. And that's the basics of putting together blocks into a row and putting rows together to make up the quilt.